Alright builders, for you pro editors out there, this is going to be one of the most important lessons. Understanding triggers and how to use them with events, operators, filters, and data sources will really open up the possibilities of what you can do in the editor. Before we get into the different types of triggers, we need to discuss how they work. The triggers function by producing an impulse and sending it along to an event or filter. The events and filters all have various actions that they perform, and the impulse is basically a message that says, alright, now it's time to do your thing. The impulse can also be passed along between events and filters, allowing you to create a chain of events that are all activated by one trigger. For this lesson, we will use a simple example, using a trigger to activate a fireworks effect. In the next lesson, we will discuss events in more detail, so for now, I've already placed an effect event and pointed it to my firework effect. Now that this connection is made, the event knows that its job is to activate the effect, but it doesn't know when. That's where the trigger comes into play. The triggers are found in the New Objects menu in the category Triggers and Events, subheading Triggers. We'll start with the Area trigger. This trigger activates when the bike, rider, or any object of your choosing enters a designated area, and is most like the triggers in Trials HD. Let's spawn one in the game world and check out its properties. The trigger can have physics properties, so we start with some options that we've seen before. By default, the area trigger appears as a cube, but you have a few other shapes to choose from, and they can be changed with the shape slider. The size of the trigger can also be adjusted. Trigger by determines what objects activate the trigger. By default, it is set to bike and rider, but in this submenu you have a few more options. Type determines how the trigger uses the items you choose. Include means whatever you choose will set off the trigger. Exclude means that anything can activate the trigger except the items you choose. Next are a number of checkboxes that are all tied to common things you may want to use to activate the trigger. Bike, rider, and ground are all obvious. Dynamic object is any object with physics activated, and static object is any object without physics. You can also choose object instances or types. Select either of these options and you get a cursor to select the objects you want. Instances refers to specific objects, so if I point it to a barrel for example, that specific barrel will activate the trigger. Type refers to any object of the same type. If we choose the same barrel using type, now any barrel like the one we selected can set off the trigger. Keep in mind when using type that different variations count as different types, so if you select an open barrel, a closed barrel will not activate the trigger. Now back out to the main properties menu. Next we have hit tolerance. This option determines how quickly the trigger deactivates when the object stops touching it. This will come in more handy when working with hit triggers, so we'll talk about it a little more in just a moment. On hit is the key option here. Select this to choose where your impulse goes when the trigger is activated. For our example, I'm going to point it towards the effect event I placed earlier. You will notice this red line made of arrows is now connecting the trigger to the event. This represents your impulse and the direction it's traveling. The disable after hit checkbox determines if the trigger can be used more than once. With this box checked, after the trigger is activated once, it will not be able to be used again unless the rider resets to the previous checkpoint, or the trigger is reactivated with a state event, which we will cover in a few lessons. Advanced events lets you get a little more complex with how the trigger works. In this submenu, you actually get the choice to send out up to 3 impulses instead of just one. So instead of just sending out when the trigger is activated, you can send one upon activation, another when your target object leaves the area, and a third that it will be sending when the trigger is not activated. When using the Advanced Events feature, you don't have to use all options. So if, for example, you only want the trigger to activate when the target object leaves the area, you can come in here to select your impulse target instead of using the On Hit option in the main properties menu. Keep in mind when using Advanced Events, you need to have the Disable After Hit checkbox unchecked, or it will only send one impulse. The Reset and Checkpoint Restart decides whether or not the trigger will reset if the rider resets to the last checkpoint. Next we have the hit trigger. This trigger activates when 2 items collide. The first properties here that we will be concerned with are set hitting objects 1 and 2. Both of these submenus contain basically the same options as the trigger by menu in area trigger. For our example, I want the firework to go off when the bike hits the ground. So I'll set hitting object 1 the bike, then I'll set hitting object 2 to the ground. Now I point my impulse to the effect event and give it a quick test. Before we move on, I'd like to elaborate a bit on the hit tolerance. Say for example, instead of wanting the effect to activate when I hit the ground, I want it to go off when I leave the ground. To start, I will sever the on-hit connection to the effect event, then go into advanced events and point on leave to the event. Now if my bike just slightly leaves the ground for a moment, the effect will activate. But if we turn the hit tolerance up, the bike will need to leave the ground for a bit longer before the trigger sends out its impulse. Our next trigger is the interval trigger. Instead of using objects in the world, the interval trigger is based on time. Properties menu, here we come. Start tick is based on the game clock and determines when the trigger will send its first impulse. By default, it's set to 0, so the trigger will immediately send an impulse as soon as the game clock starts running. A tick is basically the smallest measurement of time in the game. There are 60 ticks a second. As you increase the number of ticks, directly below that you will see it displayed in time format. Interval determines how often the trigger will send an impulse. By default it's set to 1 second, so every second the trigger will send an impulse. Reset and checkpoint restart will roll the start tick counter back to 0 when the rider resets to a checkpoint. Reset when enabled will reset the start tick counter to 0 if the trigger is toggled from disabled to enabled. Even when the interval trigger is disabled, the tick counter will still start running at the start of the game. Using this option, you can make it start counting later. Disable after n impulses allows you to set the maximum number of impulses the trigger can send. Select this checkbox, then set the number of impulses you want. With this unchecked, the trigger will continue to send impulses at the set interval until the game ends. Finally, select event filter is how you choose your impulse target. The player event trigger is a bit more simple. This trigger will send out an impulse based on the actions of the rider. Let's fire up those properties. In here we have only 3 options. Enabled and select event filter we've already discussed. Type determines what actions activate the trigger. Your choices are crash, bailout, flip, or lean. Just as a quick example, we'll make our firework activate when the rider bails out.